In terms of the sexual abuse, was there anything that you heard about the sexual abuse that was unique?
Yes.
And what would you classify as being unique?
Lyles' statement that the abuse stopped when he was a young boy.
And you found that to be unique?
I find it surprising, given all of the other factors in the case. Everything I know about his father, I found it surprising. As I said, there are some things about the molestation by his dad that I have trouble with. I'm not sure that I know everything that there is to know about what happened, but what he told me is essentially credible, and I take what he told me over the course of my time with him to be essentially credible, applying the highest standard that I must in making that assessment.
Now, when you say essentially credible, are you suggesting the information he gave you was false, or really that he didn't give you all of it?
I'm not sure that he gave it all. I think what he gave me was accurate to the extent that any human being can describe that kind of experience accurate. But when you're with someone, you develop hypotheses or areas which, if you had another 60 hours, you might explore. Or if he was a therapeutic client, I would explore with him much more whether the abuse with his dad had gone on longer than he now remembers or longer than he's willing to say. But I didn't have another 100 hours, and even more significantly, he's not a therapy client. And so, what he told me, what he was able to tell me, was plausible. It doesn't mean I do have suspicions about maybe it went on longer. That's a suspicion or a tentative hypothesis that I've made. If I were seeing him more time or in a different setting, I would explore with him. You do that with clients all the time. They tell you so much, and then you say, I think there's probably more here. The advantage of a therapy client is that you can, in 6 months or in a year, that issue may come back.
What other factors did you consider in assessing the believability of the information he gave you? Were there other activities that he described that had some importance to you? Such as the stuffed animals.
Yes, but that goes to a much larger issue, I think, than just the molestation. Yeah, I think his discussion of the stuffed animals was really quite amazing.
Well, let me stop you here. It goes to a larger issue, and is that his overall credibility in
Yes.
terms of the psychological abuse and the physical abuse and the description of the family setting?
Yes.
And what was the significance of the stuffed animals in that context?
Well, many survivors have stuffed animals. I believe Dr. Briere, I read his testimony about that, and he said that. And that is true. I think many survivors do. Although I've never actually seen that described in the literature. It's something that people who work with survivors tend to know. Maybe in the literature, I just am not aware of it. But what was phenomenal about Lyles' use of the stuffed animals is that he really, first of all, he had large numbers of them, and he gave them personalities, and he acted out scenarios with those stuffed animals, kind of issues in his life. And he had personalities in the animals, or gave personalities, that sort of represented issues in his life. He had, nasty stuffed animals, and he had weaker ones, and he had stronger ones, and he had sort of a judge who made decisions about what was going on among the stuffed animals. And in a sense that in a way that I've never heard from another victim, he, in a way, was doing play therapy. When we see traumatized kids, we often ask them to act out with animals, with puppets sometimes with a dollhouse, sometimes in sand play, their bad experiences. The difference between Lyles acting out his issues with his stuffed animals and play therapy is that there was no therapist there to help guide the process. And so there was no therapist there to help talk about the feelings that the stuffed animals had, or to maybe figure out ways that the stuffed animals could work out the scenario in a different way. So his description of how important the animals were and what he did with the animals, he took them when he buried the rabbit, for example, some of them were there, and his collecting other animals that were kind of orphaned by his brother. This is sort of an over-involvement, or it's an excessive use of animals for to meet a therapeutic need. And he told me, for example, at one point that his mom had thrown a stuffed animal out and the dogs had got it and ripped it up. And he told me that he had been able to save the hat. They're still important to him in a way, that this was a very significant thing to him. He told me that he took him to high school and it was okay because he was a popular kid. Although I read it elsewhere, I think in the school notes, that he really was kind of teased about it. But they were so important to him because they've had this therapeutic coping purpose to him. That description was wholly believable to me, and I don't think a non-victim would have known that therapeutic use. And I talked to Stacey Feldman, his first girlfriend, on my trip to New Jersey, and she described, oh yeah, the animals, and so there's confirmation just about how important these were in his life. So that's one of a number of factors, I think, that I found to be important in sort of assessing his overall credibility.
What were some of the other factors?
Well, it's a much smaller, but it's, I think, psychologically quite significant, but it's another example. When he was a young guy, Muncie, and it might have been a little bit older, he had a little ceramic leopard. When he described it, it was my memory of the kinds of things you used to be able to get at carnivals, if you tossed quarters in the bowls or something. And this leopard kind of sat up, and Lyle had a period of time where as he would walk through his room, he would have to turn the leopard so that it would be facing wherever he was. That's an externalization of anxiety. It's a little ritual that made him feel safer. It's sort of, he had a lot of internal anxiety. He would externalize it, and this was a little thing that he could do to feel safe. He also had to touch things. If he touched them once, he had to touch them again. These kinds of little rituals that...
What's the significance of that, of touching something once and then touching it again?
It's a little ritual to feel safe. It's an externalization of anxiety. Which sort of helps him, gives him something to do to relieve the tension. I got a little caught there because I was going to mention that as another kind of example. People often carry things with them that are great significant. I have a pocket knife that I carry and often touch. I don't have it today because I can't fly with it, but this sort of, it's a symbol, it's something that makes you feel safe. In Lyle's case, the leopard was that kind of a symbol, but it was also a ritual. It gave him something to do which served the purpose, I think, of reducing his level of anxiety.
Now, are things such as the extensive involvement with the animals, the moving of the leopard, or the touching things twice, is that information that is available in the public domain in terms of reading magazine articles, or is this rather unusual behavior?
It's unusual behavior. I've not read everything that's in all popular literature, but I have seen a number of movies and television shows, and I've never heard these kinds of behaviors described as a something that victims do. So I find it hard to believe that he read about it someplace. But even more than that, the way he described it without knowing the psychological significance of what was going on. He described it in a way that I've heard other victims talk about that kind of thing. I've had other clients, none of whom have had a leopard or had that excessive stuffed animals, but who've done other kinds of things or had other kinds of acts or activities that made them feel safe, or other ways of dealing with anxiety. There are things that Lyle didn't tell me that I think are significant. I mean, some of the physical complaints that are consistent with victimization that the medical records tend to describe. I think that sort of increases believability.
Such as?
Oh, nausea and stomach aches.
So he did not relate to you anything about nausea or stomach aches?
He didn't describe physical symptoms to me really at all, although I did ask, and the fact that they are present in the record and he didn't talk about it, I think increases believability or credibility. Other sort of things that would appear on the face of it innocuous. I mean, I believe it was Alicia Hertz, one of the school counselors, or it might have been a school nurse, where Lyle went to her once and just sort of sat in her presence He never described that to me, but that neediness, I mean, it's somebody who was really sophisticated in making up a story. I mean, I think they could describe, I was emotionally needy, and I used to go sit next to someone and wanted to tell them about it and never had the courage to do it. But he didn't even mention that. So when I read that, that didn't necessarily confirm sexual abuse, but it certainly confirmed that this was a very needy kid who maybe had something to tell, or at least wanted to be around someone to feel a sense of nurturing and support. I think his not understanding the significance of the stuffed animals or of the leopard he touched or some of those things, his not understanding what he was telling and being embarrassed when he was telling, and sort of, I mean, those all were factors that tended, I think, to increase believability.
How is it then that he was this very abused child who was suffering from fear and reacting to his parents' responses, and his life was going along very well? How do you reconcile those two?
Well, it's not hard to reconcile at all. I mean, people who are victims of horrible child abuse can nonetheless have successful businesses or can go to school or what have you. His life, in many ways, and I think I testified to this at least twice already, his life in many ways was better than it had been. His father was paying less attention to tennis. He had a condo to go back to. He had a girlfriend. You know, in that objective real-world sense, very much like a battered woman has a family and powerful brothers or something to rely on. He had this other life. But back in California with his brother, unable to run away, fearing of his father, he functioned as an abused child. I don't think that's inconsistent at all.
And you're not an advocate for Lyle Menendez, is that correct? Doctor?
I think I've said that, yes.